Owing to a unique mix of architectural influences and the fact that it held the status of the largest city in Canada before the post-war suburban development boom, Montreal is among the best cities in North America for so-called missing middle housing. This refers to housing that's not as tall as high-rise towers, but also not as spread out as detached homes. And it includes residential styles like duplexes, triplexes, row houses, and low-rise apartment buildings that are lacking in a lot of North American cities, especially ones that really grew after World War II and applied a regime of restrictive suburban-style rules and regulations against density. This middle ground of housing is interesting because, if implemented properly, it can balance advantages of lower density living, like personal space and independence, with advantages of higher densities, like allowing more housing to be built and supporting more walkable and sustainable neighborhoods where people can live closer to the things they need, like schools, stores, parks, jobs, and bike shops. We've already covered the livability features of Montreal's housing in other videos, so in this video we're going to dive deeper into population density, profiling 5 Montreal neighborhoods that achieve much more density than typical North American suburban development, while staying on a low-rise scale.
We're going to start with the neighborhood of Pointe-Saint-Charles, situated to the southwest of downtown. An early industrial center of the city due to train yards, factories, and the nearby Lachine Canal, this district is arguably the origin of the low-rise stacked apartments that define so much of Montreal. Early versions of this distinctly Montreal housing started to be built in this neighborhood in the 1850s, and they were 2 floors at first, with 3-floor buildings starting to show up a few decades later. Although a majority of these buildings have 2 or more units across separate floors, some are actually just single-family attached homes, whether they were originally built like that or they were converted more recently from something like a duplex. Pointe-Saint-Charles has a population density in residential blocks of around 15,000 people per square kilometer, roughly 5 times denser than a block of single-family homes in a suburban area of Montreal, where you typically find a density of about 3,000 people per square kilometer. That's a lot of density to achieve mostly through 2- and 3-story buildings, and it's our first example of how denser urban living doesn't have to mean towers. A lot of this density comes just from avoiding particularly space-intensive suburban features like prominent front lawns and space between houses. Most buildings here are attached to the side, while on the front they either come right to the street or have modest setbacks of 1 or 2 meters. What you don't necessarily notice from the street, though, is that nearly every building has a backyard, many of them with swimming pools. These buildings weren't planned around swimming pools. Originally, the backyards were used for wells, laundry facilities, and coal storage, but the prioritization of backyards over front lawns is still really intriguing for modern-day uses, because arguably backyards are more functional. Even when people have large suburban front yards, that's typically not where they choose to put their sheds, pools, barbecues, swing sets, or other things they spend time using. Often when people have prominent front yards, the most time they spend there is mowing the grass. Be honest, did you even use the front yard when playing The Sims?
Our next neighborhood for Montreal's not-so-missing middle housing is Mile End, north of downtown past the mountain. Mile End was built a few decades after Pointe-Saint-Charles, and as a result it has more 3-story residences. This brings Mile End's density to about 18,000 people per square kilometer, or 6 times denser than a detached suburban neighborhood. Mile End and Pointe-Saint-Charles share a lot of space management features, including prioritizing backyards over front yards and having buildings be attached on the side. One difference, though, is that the newer and predominantly 3-story buildings of Mile End tend to have more external structures on the building, like external staircases, balconies, galleries, and verandas. These extensions of the building give each unit more space at the same building density. Along these lines, some residences, both in Mile End and Pointe-Saint-Charles, also have rooftop patios. This isn't as common as maybe it should be, but it's a really clever way to add livable space, and it's not just on new buildings. Another thing Pointe-Saint-Charles and Mile End have in common is that they save space by not having a large suburban driveway or garage, because they were built before widespread car usage and most importantly before the mid-century planning idea that you can just solve transportation by having everyone drive everywhere. There are still many cars in these neighborhoods, typically parked on the street or in the back alley, but these neighborhoods don't universally have room for 2 or 3 or more cars per household like in the suburbs. Like Pointe-Saint-Charles, Mile End has very working-class origins, being at one point the home of the city's textile industry. Both neighborhoods have experienced gentrification over the past few decades, but Mile End especially so, having become a very trendy neighborhood associated with artists, cafes, bagel shops, and technology jobs. The old clothing factories have been repurposed, and one of them now houses video game maker Ubisoft.
It made sense to start an overview of missing middle housing in Montreal with traditionally working-class neighborhoods like Pointe-Saint-Charles and Mile End, which covers so much of the central city. But it's important to mention that you can find similar enough neighborhoods spanning much of the income spectrum. The very richest people in Montreal live in mansions at the top of the Westmount or Outremont summits of Mount Royal. but many of the city's medium-density neighborhoods are middle or even upper class. One example is the middle-class district of Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, or NDG, situated to the west of downtown. This part of the city was built in the early 1900s, around the same time as Mile End, but NDG is visibly less dense, with most residences having 2 floors instead of 3, and there being more gaps between buildings. Residences here also have larger front yards, sometimes including a driveway. With that said, the front yard is still pretty modest by suburban standards, and most buildings are attached. All in all, NDG, especially the eastern sector closer to Westmount that we're focusing on, still works out to 9,000 people per square kilometer, or about 3 times as dense as the standard suburban neighborhood of detached houses.
According to the most extensive study of housing in the city, the willingness to have multifamily and attached housing, even in middle-class neighborhoods, reflects Montreal being less influenced by Anglo-American ideals surrounding homeownership and detached houses compared to other cities like Toronto. The predominance of small-scale buildings of 2 to 6 units instead of large centralized apartment blocks reflects the smaller scale of both landlords and builders. Landlords were often just regular families wanting something like a duplex to live in one unit and rent the other one out. This actually goes all the way back to the New France era, when rules and customs made real estate less of a speculative asset that would receive the attention of wealthier investors.
Montreal's unique housing situation has deep cultural and economic roots, which helps to explain why the city didn't give up on medium-density housing even as it also participated in the lower-density suburban development boom after World War II. The East End neighborhood of Saint-Leonard, which was mainly built from the 1950s to the 1970s, has many sections of single-family detached homes that could pass for anywhere else in North America, but it also has blocks based on a variation of Montreal's stacked apartments adapted to fit more cars. This more car-friendly suburban refresh of Montreal's housing has 2 main residential floors plus a semi-basement level with garages and more residential space, whether a dedicated basement apartment or basement space for upper floor units. The modest room between buildings and the always present driveways do take up space compared to the older neighborhoods we covered, but consistently having 3 levels helps the density from falling that much, even if some of the space is taken by the garage. The density in these sections of Saint-Leonard is about 12,000 people per square kilometer, which as we've covered is about 4 times higher than an average block of detached homes in Montreal, but it's also about 3 times denser than the specific detached homes on nearby streets in Saint-Leonard. In this video, we're mostly interested in the external features of these buildings, but the internal room also matters. In Montreal, units in a mid-rise or high-rise building typically have 1 or 2 bedrooms, while detached houses typically have 3 or 4. There's not a lot of overlap between these very distinct building configurations, but Montreal's medium-density housing fits right in the middle, unsurprisingly, with 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units being common.
The 5th and final neighborhood that we're going to profile in our exploration of medium-density neighborhoods is Angus, a new development in the borough of Rosemont in the city's East End. Construction of this district started in the early 2000s and continues today, on the reclaimed site of the Angus Shops, a major train manufacturing facility that originally made up the city's second big industrial center after the Pointe-Saint-Charles area. This new development in Angus is a big departure from the other 4 neighborhoods we've seen in that the style is much more modern and less distinctly Montreal. A few of the buildings also grow a little taller, up to 6 stories, which is higher than some definitions of the missing middle. Still, overall, we see this neighborhood as falling within Montreal's tradition of medium-density housing, with around 12,000 people per square kilometer, 4 times higher than in suburbia. This density is achieved through a mixture of housing types, including 2 to 3 story townhouses, 3 to 6 story condo complexes, and some semi-detached houses. Most of these buildings have another level with underground parking, letting more cars be stored here than in older neighborhoods without them all taking up surface space, although underground parking still adds either construction costs or takes more space that could be used for other purposes. One interesting feature of this neighborhood is that some sections have townhouses or small condo complexes facing a courtyard instead of a street with traffic. This saves space because there doesn't have to be a street in front of everyone's door, and it seems like it blurs the boundaries between a backyard and a front yard in interesting ways, because this court is essentially a communal front yard that's secluded from the street but open to your neighbors. Of course, units also have their own modest but private back patios and balconies.
Canadians and Americans are very used to associating density with tall buildings, so questions of densifying cities usually end up as arguments about whether high-rise towers are good for people or neighborhoods. We definitely don't oppose high-rise towers, especially when so many cities are facing a severe lack of housing supply. But there's a serious lack of imagination when we can only think of housing at the 2 extreme ends of low-density detached homes or high-density skyscrapers. These 5 Montreal neighborhoods show that a range of intermediate possibilities exist and should be part of the conversation too. Interestingly, if you are someone who thinks that high-rise towers are bad for people or neighborhoods, this medium-density housing is exactly what you should want to see allowed or even encouraged. One Montreal urbanism and transportation blog makes a good argument that Montreal has fewer high-rise residential towers than Vancouver and Toronto, not to mention lower rents, because of its abundant medium-density housing stock. If you restrict most of your city to low-density detached homes, the small amount of land that is legal to develop has to make up for that with even more units, and that means building higher and higher. In addition to showing that density without towers is possible, Montreal also allows us to draw some lessons for how to achieve ground-oriented density. This obviously includes making use of multifamily or attached buildings, but it also includes prioritizing backyards over front lawns, having less room for cars or at least storing them underground, building to 3 or maybe even 4 stories instead of 1 or 2, and adding livable space to the building with balconies, verandas, and rooftop patios.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video and sharing our fascination with Montreal housing. From a policy perspective, what we'd really like to see is North American cities liberalize zoning rules to allow some substantial form of low-rise, medium-density housing to be built in all neighborhoods by default. It's understandable that you can't build a 30-story building everywhere, but you probably should be able to build a 3-story multi-unit building basically wherever you want, and without parking requirements or excessive setback and lot coverage rules that substantially dilute the density and add to the cost. If people want to build or buy detached suburban homes, then that's fine, but it's absurd to enshrine that one very particular housing configuration with the special legal status of being the only type of housing allowed to be built on most land in most North American cities. These 5 not-so-missing-middle neighborhoods all came out as 3 to 6 times denser than typical suburbs. That relied on a suburban density benchmark of 3,000 people per square kilometer, which is basically the median density of a residential block of single-family detached homes on the island of Montreal. It's definitely possible to build detached homes denser than this, but in Montreal the higher end reaches about 5,000 people per square kilometer. It's also very much possible to build detached homes less dense than this, and these predominate in a lot of smaller towns and cities in Canada, and in some surprisingly large US cities too. The density values provided for the 5 neighborhoods in this video are meant to be approximate. For a more precise and in-depth exploration of density, the same blog mentioned before has an analysis of a range of housing configurations in Quebec and the rest of Canada. I read this a few years ago before we even moved to Montreal, and it was a big influence in making us interested in Montreal's unique housing. We've linked that resource in the description, alongside other resources like the report on the history of Montreal housing.